Hello, and welcome to Whispers of Time. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, there are silent cities. Colossal stone pyramids rise above the jungle canopy, their plazas and temples choked by the roots of ancient trees. For centuries, they were a forgotten world, a mystery known only to the local peoples who lived in the shadow of their sleeping stone ancestors. This was the world of the classic Maya, a civilization that at its peak was one of the most advanced on Earth. They developed the only complete writing system in the ancient Americas, created a calendar of breathtaking accuracy, and tracked the movements of the stars with a precision unmatched for 1,000 years. They were a people of divine kings, sacred rituals performed in blood, and magnificent art that still takes our breath away. And then, in the heart of their southern homelands, they vanished. Not overnight, but in a slow, mysterious unraveling that saw their greatest cities abandoned and their population plummet by millions. Why? This is one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. Tonight, we will journey into the world of the silent cities to investigate their fall. We will explore their golden age, and then, like archaeologists piecing together fragments, we will examine the clues left behind in the stones and in the earth. Clues that point to a perfect storm of endemic warfare, catastrophic drought, and a self-inflicted environmental disaster. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Our journey takes us deep into the green heart of the jungle, to the mystery of the silent cities, the discovery of a lost world. For centuries, the great stone cities of the Maya slept, shrouded in the green embrace of the Central American rainforest. To the outside world, they did not exist. Vague rumors and scattered reports from Spanish missionaries or local woodsmen told of strange stone idols and vast collapsed palaces hidden deep in the jungle, but these were largely dismissed as fantasy. The prevailing wisdom of the 19th century held that no great indigenous civilization could have possibly risen in the Americas. The ruins, if they were real at all, must have been the work of Egyptians, a lost tribe of Israel, or some other foreign race. The men who would shatter this prejudice were a remarkable pair. One was John Lloyd Stevens, an American lawyer, diplomat, and celebrated travel writer with an insatiable curiosity for the forgotten corners of the world. The other was Frederick Catherwood, a British architect and artist of immense talent, gifted with a meticulous eye for detail and a steady hand. In 1839, drawn by the whispers of these lost cities, they set out on an expedition into the largely unmapped and politically volatile jungles of what is now Honduras and Guatemala. Their journey was grueling. They traveled by mule through a dense, suffocatingly humid rainforest, plagued by insects, mud, and torrential rain. They found themselves in the middle of a chaotic civil war, having to negotiate safe passage with suspicious, heavily armed local generals. But they pressed on, following a local guide until one day they arrived at a site near the Copan River in Honduras. Hacking their way through the thick undergrowth with machetes, they stumbled into a clearing. What they saw changed the course of history. Rising from the jungle floor were magnificent stone monuments, stelae, intricately carved from top to bottom, with the portraits of strange regal kings and complex geometric symbols unlike anything they had ever seen. Catherwood, the architect, was stunned by the quality of the art, recognizing it as the work of a culture as sophisticated as that of ancient Egypt or Greece. But it was Stevens who grasped the true significance. These were not the works of a foreign people. This was the unique, powerful, and utterly forgotten legacy of an indigenous American civilization. So convinced was he of its importance, Stevens formally purchased the ruins of Copan from its bewildered owner for the sum of $50, making himself one of the first tourism entrepreneurs of the Maya world. While Stevens began to document their journey in his journal, Catherwood set to his painstaking work. In the sweltering heat, his hands swollen from insect bites, he used a device called a camera lucida to project the images of the carvings onto his paper, allowing him to trace their complex details with an accuracy that had never before been possible. His stunning, evocative drawings were not romantic fantasies. They were precise, architectural, and artistic records, the first true visual account of the Maya world ever seen by the public. Their journey continued, revealing one marvel after another. They explored the elegant multi-storied palace of Palenque in Mexico, its delicate stucco reliefs emerging from the jungle mist. They reached the colossal ruins of Tikal in Guatemala, where the tallest stone pyramids in the Americas rose like man-made mountains, their peaks breaking through the vast green canopy of the rainforest. When Stevens published his book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, filled with Catherwood's breathtaking illustrations, it became an international sensation. It proved beyond any doubt that a great and sophisticated civilization had risen and fallen in the Americas long before the arrival of Columbus. The silent cities had been found. The world now knew that they existed, but a profound mystery had been uncovered. Who were the people who built these magnificent cities, and why had they abandoned them to the jungle? The Golden Age, a civilization at its peak. The discoveries of Stevens and Catherwood opened a window into a new and complex world. What emerged from the archaeological work that followed was a picture of a civilization that for over 6 centuries, from roughly 250 to 900 AD, dominated the intellectual and artistic landscape of ancient America. This was the classic Maya. It is crucial to understand that the Maya were not a single unified empire ruled from one great capital. Their world was a dynamic and often volatile network of dozens of independent city-states, each controlling its own territory and vying for influence. Great cities like Tikal and Palenque, Copan, and the mighty serpent kingdom of Calakmul were rivals. Their history, which we can now read from their stone monuments, is one of constantly shifting alliances, strategic royal marriages, and intense ritualized warfare. The foundation of this entire civilization, the substance that built the Great Pyramids and fueled its complex society, was a single plant, maize or corn. The Maya were the people of the corn. It was not just their primary food source, it was the very center of their religion and their identity. Their entire existence was a partnership with this vital crop, a difficult challenge in the thin soil and unpredictable rainfall of a tropical rainforest environment. They developed ingenious agricultural techniques to survive, from slash-and-burn farming in small jungle plots to building elaborate terraces on hillsides and creating raised irrigated fields in the swamps. The cycle of planting, growth, and harvest was not just a task. It was the central sacred drama of their lives. At the heart of this sacred drama stood the king, the Kuhul Ajau, or Holy Lord. The Maya king was not simply a political ruler or a general. He was a divine shaman, the chief intermediary between the mortal world of his subjects and the supernatural realm of the gods and royal ancestors. His primary duty was not to govern, but to perform the sacred rituals that maintained the order of the cosmos, ensured the sun would rise each day, and most critically, brought the seasonal rains that allowed the maize to grow. To fulfill this sacred duty, the king's most potent offering was his own blood. In deeply important ceremonies, the Ajah would perform a ritual of bloodletting, using a terrifyingly sharp obsidian lancet, a stingray spine, or a sharpened piece of bone. He would pierce his own tongue, earlobes, or even his genitals, allowing his blood to fall onto strips of paper held in a bowl. This paper was then burned, and in the swirling smoke, it was believed that a portal would open, a vision serpent through which the king could communicate with the gods and ancestors to petition them for the survival of his people. This was the great cosmic bargain at the heart of Maya civilization. The people fed the king with tribute from their cornfields. The king, in turn, fed the gods with his own sacred blood. As long as this bargain held, the universe was in balance. The cities flourished and the maize would grow. It was a powerful and deeply ingrained system of belief, but it rested on a fragile and dangerous promise that the king's piety could control the sky itself. At its height, around the year 750 AD, the world of the classic Maya must have seemed eternal. The great city-states of the southern lowlands were thriving. Tikal, with its towering temple pyramids, was a bustling metropolis, home to perhaps 60,000 people. The kings of Calakmul, the mighty serpent kingdom, controlled a vast network of vassal cities. At Copan, artisans were carving some of the most complex and beautiful monuments in the ancient Americas. The population was at its peak, the traditions were strong, and the intricate gears of the sacred calendar seemed to promise a predictable and divinely ordered future. The voice of the stones, Maya, intellectual achievement. For decades after their rediscovery, the silent cities of the Maya kept their deepest secrets. The intricate carvings that covered their monuments and temples were a profound puzzle. Scholars saw them not as a language, but as a mysterious collection of symbolic pictures and decorations. The true story of the Maya, it was believed, was lost forever. But they were wrong. Hidden within those beautiful, complex carvings was the only true writing system ever developed in the ancient Americas, a voice that once understood would allow the silent cities to finally tell their own history. Unlike a simple alphabet, the Maya script was a sophisticated and beautiful logosyllabic system. This means that some of its glyphs or symbols represent whole words, while others represent phonetic syllables. A scribe could write the same word in multiple ways, either with a single intricate picture glyph or by spelling it out syllable by syllable. These glyphs were artfully arranged into square blocks, and their texts were written in paired columns, read from left to right and top to bottom in a zigzag pattern. For centuries, this complexity made the script seem impenetrable, a work of art rather than a language. The key to their writing, and indeed their entire worldview, was their advanced system of mathematics. The Maya developed a vigesimal, or base 20 number system of elegant simplicity. A single dot represented the number 1, a horizontal bar represented 5, and a stylized shell symbol represented a concept that was, for its time, a stroke of pure genius: 0. The independent invention of 0 was a monumental intellectual leap that many other great civilizations, including the Romans, never made. For the Maya, it was an essential tool, allowing them to make calculations that reached into the millions and to track the vast cycles of time with perfect precision. Time for the Maya was a sacred obsession. They did not have one calendar, but a series of complex interlocking systems that governed every aspect of their lives. The first was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred calendar used for divination and religious ceremony. Running parallel to this was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar that governed the agricultural seasons. These two calendars worked together like intricate gears, creating a larger 52-year cycle. To track their history across even vaster spans of time, they created the long count, a linear and stunningly accurate count of the number of days that had passed since a mythical creation date in the year 3114 BC. It is this long count, carved onto their stone monuments, that allows archaeologists today to date the reigns of their kings and the history of their cities with an accuracy unparalleled in the ancient world. This mastery of mathematics and timekeeping was driven by a profound and patient observation of the cosmos. Maya priest astronomers, from observatories built atop their pyramids, tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets with incredible accuracy. They could predict solar and lunar eclipses, events they saw as powerful and often dangerous omens. They were particularly obsessed with the cycles of Venus, which they associated with warfare and sacred ritual. The glyphs, the mathematics, the calendars, and the astronomy were all part of a single unified quest to understand the divine order of the universe. The Maya saw the cosmos not as a place of chaos, but as a vast, intricate, and predictable machine governed by the repeating cycles of time. Their great intellectual mission was to decipher the workings of this machine and to align their society with its sacred rhythms through precise rituals and meticulous record-keeping. The universe, to them, was a text written in the language of the stars, and they were its devoted and brilliant readers. The mystery of what these glyphs actually said remained locked away until the mid-20th century. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a young Russian linguist named Yuri Knorozov, working in isolation in post-war Leningrad. In 1952, Knorozov published a groundbreaking paper arguing that the Maya glyphs were not purely ideographic, but were instead a mixed system, largely phonetic in nature. Each glyph could represent either whole words or syllabic sounds. His work was initially ridiculed in the West, particularly by the influential English archaeologist J. Eric S. Thompson, who had long championed the view that Maya writing was primarily mystical and astronomical. But Knorozov was essentially correct. The person who would prove the historical nature of the texts was Tatiana Proskuryakov, a Russian-born architect and scholar working at Harvard's Peabody Museum. In 1960, while analyzing a series of stelae from the site of Piedras Negras, she noticed a recurring pattern. The monuments showed groups of dates that spanned roughly 60 to 80 years, the normal lifespan of a human being. In a flash of insight, she realized these were not astronomical records, but human histories, recording the births, accessions, and deaths of Maya kings. Her discovery completely overturned the prevailing view and validated Knorozov's phonetic approach. With this new understanding, a new generation of scholars began to make astonishing progress. The floodgates opened, the names of the great rulers of Palenque and Tikal emerged from the stone. The complex political histories of the city-states, their wars, their alliances, their royal marriages, all of it could now be read. The silent cities were finally able to tell their own stories in their own words. This decipherment, completed largely in the 1970s and 1980s, was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. The first signs of collapse. But this was the peak before a long and mysterious fall. The first sign that something was going profoundly wrong is written in stone, or rather, in the sudden absence of writing. For centuries, the Maya kings had obsessively chronicled their reigns, dedicating magnificent stone stelae, tall carved monuments, to mark important dates and victories. Thanks to their precise long-count calendar, we can track this history with incredible accuracy. And it is this very accuracy that allows us to see the unraveling as it happened. Starting in the late 8th century, one by one, the cities began to fall silent. At Palenque, the last dated monument is from 799 AD. At Copan, it is 822 AD. The last great monument at the superpower city of Tikal is dated to 169 AD. After these dates, the tradition that had defined their civilization for centuries simply stops. The kings were no longer commissioning these public declarations of their power. This sudden silence in the archaeological record is a stark and chilling testament to a system in crisis. The public voice of the divine kings was being extinguished. Further evidence of this societal breakdown was found in the very hearts of the cities. Archaeologists have uncovered massive construction projects, new temples, expansions to palaces, grand ceremonial causeways that were left mysteriously unfinished. It is a ghostly sight. Vast plazas only half paved and intricately carved stone blocks left abandoned in the quarries or along the roadways, as if the stonemasons and laborers simply put down their tools one day and walked away. The engine of Maya civilization was grinding to a halt. In these final desperate years, the very character of the cities began to change. At some sites, we see evidence of hastily built, crude fortifications being thrown up around the central palaces and temples, a stark contrast to the open, confident design of the classic period. This was a world that was suddenly living in fear. At the same time, the quality of elite goods, from painted pottery to carved jade, shows a marked decline. The sophisticated trade networks that had supplied the cities with luxury items were clearly breaking down, and the ranks of the master craftsmen were thinning. It is crucial to understand that this was not a monolithic event that affected all Maya people equally. The collapse was centered on the great ancient cities of the southern lowlands, the traditional heartland of the civilization. While Tikal and Calakmul were dying, cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula like Chichen Itza were actually beginning to enter a new period of growth and influence, a final brilliant flowering of Maya culture. But in the south, the evidence is undeniable. Over a period of about 150 years, the great ancient cities that had stood for centuries emptied out. A civilization that had thrived for more than 600 years simply unraveled, its people vanishing from their magnificent homes. The silence of the abandoned temples and the last carved dates on the stone stelae posed the great question that has haunted historians and archaeologists for over a century. What happened here? Why did they leave? The warfare. Hypothesis: violence escalates. As archaeologists began to decipher the Maya script and piece together the history of the great southern cities, a dramatic and violent picture emerged. For centuries, warfare had been an integral part of their civilization, but it was a conflict with a unique character. For the most part, classic Maya warfare was a highly ritualized and limited affair. The goal was not typically to conquer vast territories or annihilate enemy populations, but to capture rival kings and high-ranking nobles. These elite captives would then be taken back to the victor's city, where they would be publicly humiliated, tortured, and ultimately sacrificed in grand religious ceremonies to appease the gods and demonstrate the power of the victorious king, or Aja. But in the final century of the classic period, during the time of the unraveling, the evidence shows that the nature of this warfare began to change. The art carved onto stone monuments and painted on palace walls becomes grimmer and more chaotic. The earlier formal depictions of a single king capturing a rival lord are replaced by more desperate scenes. Masked armies clashing in the jungle, warriors in fearsome jaguar pelts and feathered headdresses battling over wooden palisades, and dozens of bound, miserable captives being presented for judgment. The magnificent and famously graphic murals at the site of Bonampak, for instance, depict a brutal battle followed by a horrifying scene of captured nobles having their fingernails ripped out before their final sacrifice. This artistic shift is confirmed by what has been found in the ground. At once open and confident cities like Tikal, archaeologists have discovered the remains of hastily constructed defensive walls and moats thrown up around the central temples and palaces. These were not the grand planned fortifications of a military culture. They were desperate last-ditch efforts of a society that was suddenly living in fear. At some sites, excavators have found mass graves filled with skeletons showing clear signs of violent death, evidence of large-scale conflict that went far beyond the capture of a few elites. The most detailed picture of this escalating violence comes from the Pitex Batun region of Guatemala. Here, a dynasty of kings at the city of Dos Pilas embarked on a campaign of aggressive expansionist warfare against their neighbors. For a time, they were successful, creating a small empire. But their aggression ultimately backfired, triggering a death spiral of constant retaliatory conflict that consumed the entire region. The final capital, Aguateca, was abandoned so rapidly in the face of an attack around 810 AD that meals were left half-eaten in the kitchens and valuable objects were left on the floors of the houses. Evidence of this violent end is dramatic. Archaeologists found broken chert bifacial points, the tips of spears and weapons scattered throughout the royal residences. The city was captured, burned, and its population dispersed. At the site of Colha in Belize, a center of stone tool production, the evidence is even more chilling. A mass grave known as the Colha Skull Pit contained the remains of at least 30 individuals. The skulls showed evidence that the faces of these people had been flayed, their skin cut away before they were decapitated. This was not ritual sacrifice as it had been practiced for centuries. This was something darker, more desperate. Recent research has also revealed that violent warfare was not limited to the terminal classic period, as was once thought. In 2019, scientists analyzing sediment cores from a lake near the Maya city of Huitzna found a distinct charcoal layer dating to 697 AD. This corresponded exactly with a hieroglyphic inscription from the nearby city of Naranjo that stated Huitzna had burned on May 21st of that year. Archaeological evidence confirmed widespread destruction and burning of major monuments and buildings across Huitzna. The city never recovered. This suggests that the Maya engaged in tactics akin to total warfare, where entire cities were targeted for destruction, much earlier than previously thought. This leads to the first major theory for the Maya collapse, that the highly ritualized endemic warfare that had been a stable part of their political system for centuries simply spun out of control. A series of escalating conflicts could have created a domino effect, with constant fighting making it impossible for farmers to tend their fields, leading to food shortages. It would have disrupted the vital trade routes that brought in essential goods like salt and obsidian, and as kings began to lose battles and were unable to protect their people, the population's faith in the entire system of divine kingship would have crumbled. Environmental degradation, a self-inflicted wound. The escalating warfare between the Maya city-states provides a compelling, violent picture of the final years of the Classic period, but it still doesn't answer the deeper question: why did the violence spiral out of control? A growing body of scientific evidence suggests that the Maya were not just fighting each other. They were fighting a losing battle against their own environment, a battle brought on by the very success of their civilization. This theory suggests the collapse was a self-inflicted wound. The tropical rainforest of the Maya heartland is a deceptive landscape. It seems eternally lush and fertile, but in reality, its soils are surprisingly thin and easily depleted. Supporting a large, dense population in this environment required brilliant agricultural engineering and careful management. For centuries, the Maya were masters of this, using sophisticated techniques of terracing and raised fields to feed their growing cities. But as their population swelled to its peak in the 8th century, the pressure on the land became immense. The first great demand was for food. A single city like Tikal may have housed over 60,000 people, requiring vast areas of the surrounding forest to be cleared for the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. The second, and perhaps even more voracious demand, was for architecture. The magnificent Maya pyramids and palaces were not bare stone. They were covered in a thick, smooth coating of brilliant white lime plaster, or stucco, which was then often painted in vibrant colors. To create this plaster, the Maya had to quarry limestone and then burn it at an extremely high temperature. The only fuel available for this process was vast quantities of green wood. Archaeologists have calculated the staggering environmental cost of this architectural tradition. To produce the lime plaster for just one of the Great Pyramids at Tikal would have required the felling of nearly 1,000 acres of pristine forest. As rival kings competed in a kind of architectural arms race, each trying to outdo the other by building ever grander temples to the gods and monuments to their own glory, the rate of deforestation would have accelerated dramatically. In the centuries leading up to the collapse, the landscape around the great cities was likely transformed from a dense jungle into a patchwork of cornfields and barren, denuded hillsides. This widespread deforestation would have triggered a cascade of devastating consequences. Without the complex root systems of the trees to anchor the thin topsoil, the intense seasonal rains would have washed it away into the rivers and lowland swamps, destroying the fertility of the farmland. Widespread deforestation can also affect the local climate, reducing the amount of moisture the land retains and releases into the atmosphere, potentially making the crucial dry seasons even longer and more severe. And of course, the loss of the forest meant the loss of vital resources the Maya depended on for their daily lives: game animals for hunting, wood for building homes and for cooking, and a vast pharmacy of medicinal plants. The evidence for this environmental degradation is written in the mud at the bottom of the regions. Lakes. Scientists who have drilled deep into these lake beds can analyze the ancient pollen trapped in the sediment layers. In the layers corresponding to the late Classic period, they see a dramatic drop in tree pollen and a massive spike in the pollen of weeds, a clear signature of widespread deforestation. At the same time, the sediment layers themselves become thick with eroded soil washed down from the surrounding hills. However, it's important to note that the evidence for deforestation is not uniform across all Maya sites. Recent research at Copan, for instance, has challenged the narrative of complete environmental collapse. Analysis of a longer sediment core from that site showed that forest cover actually increased from 400 to 900 AD, suggesting that at least some Maya communities were able to manage their forests sustainably even during the late Classic period. This variability is important. It suggests that environmental degradation was likely more severe in some areas than others, which might help explain why some cities collapsed while others survived or even thrived. The very things that were the hallmarks of the classic Maya's success in some regions, their large, dense populations and their monumental, dazzling white cities, appear to have been the seeds of their downfall in others. By pushing their fragile tropical environment beyond its breaking point in some areas, they created a civilization that was living on a knife's edge, with no margin for error. The climate catastrophe. When the sky fell silent. The story of endemic warfare and environmental damage reveals a classic Maya civilization that was becoming dangerously unstable, its foundations stressed to the breaking point. But to find what was likely the final decisive blow that shattered their world, we must look to the sky. The Maya were a civilization built on a covenant with the rain. Their entire agricultural system was dependent on the predictable seasonal downpours that would fill their massive man-made reservoirs and nourish their fields of maize. For centuries, this covenant held. But in the final years of the Classic period, the sky fell silent. For a long time, the idea of a catastrophic drought was just one theory among many, with little direct proof. But in recent decades, a new generation of scientists, acting as historical detectives, has found a way to read the climate of the distant past. They have discovered natural archives that have meticulously recorded the rainfall of every single year for thousands of years. They drill deep into the beds of lakes in the Yucatan Peninsula, extracting long cores of sediment. In the layers of mud, they can measure the concentration of gypsum, a mineral that precipitates out of the water in greater amounts during dry years, leaving a clear chemical signature of drought. An even more precise record is kept in the region's vast underground caves. Here, over millennia, water dripping from the ceiling has formed colossal stalagmites. Like the rings of a tree, these stone formations grow in microscopic layers, and by analyzing the oxygen and hydrogen isotopes trapped within each layer, paleoclimatologists can reconstruct ancient weather patterns with astonishing, almost year-by-year accuracy. When these two independent records, from the lake beds and the caves, were finally cross-referenced, they told the same unambiguous story. The scientific data shows that the period of the classic Maya's greatest growth, from roughly 300 to 600 AD, corresponded to a time of unusually high and reliable rainfall. This benevolent climate allowed their population to boom and their great cities to flourish. The wettest decades, between 440 and 660 AD, coincided with the establishment of large numbers of new cities. But then, beginning around the year 750 AD, just as the southern cities began to unravel, the climate shifted dramatically. The region was plunged into a prolonged, century-long period of severe drought, punctuated by a series of multi-decade mega-droughts that were unlike anything the civilization had ever endured. Recent research has quantified just how severe these droughts were. By analyzing the isotopes in gypsum crystals from Lake Chichancanab, scientists determined that annual precipitation decreased between 41 and 54% during the period of the Maya collapse, with periods of up to 70% rainfall reduction during peak drought conditions. Relative humidity declined by 2 to 7% compared to today. These were not minor dry spells. These were civilization-ending catastrophes. The impact would have been apocalyptic. The great, carefully constructed reservoirs that were the pride of cities like Tikal would have slowly evaporated, shrinking into vast plains of cracked, dry mud. The maize crop, the foundation of their entire society, would have failed season after season, leading to catastrophic famine and widespread malnutrition. The jungle itself, which seemed so eternally lush, would have begun to wither, its water table dropping, until even the sacred sinkhole wells, the cenotes, ran dry. The great cities, with their tens of thousands of inhabitants, would have become death traps, places of starvation and thirst. This powerful scientific evidence provides the most compelling driver for the collapse. While escalating warfare and deforestation had already weakened the Maya and reduced their ability to cope with a crisis, it was this catastrophic, century-long change in the climate that likely delivered the final inescapable blows. The divine kings, the Ajah, whose power rested entirely on their claim to be able to bring the rain through their sacred bloodletting rituals, would have performed ever more desperate ceremonies, piercing themselves again and again, offering their blood to the gods. But the sky remained silent. The rains did not come. As the rains failed, so too would the people's faith in the very system that had governed their lives for centuries, triggering the total societal collapse that we see in the silent, abandoned cities. The perfect storm. How it all came together. The mystery of the classic Maya collapse is not a case with a single simple answer. There was no one smoking gun that brought down this magnificent civilization. Instead, modern science and archaeology have revealed a much more complex and tragic story. A story of a perfect storm, where a series of interconnected crises fed into one another, creating a devastating cascade of failure from which the Maya of the southern lands could not recover. The foundation for the disaster had been laid over centuries. As we have seen, the very success of the classic Maya, their soaring populations and their competitive temple building, led to widespread deforestation in many areas, and the erosion of their fragile soils. They had pushed their environment to its absolute limit in some regions, creating a brilliant but brittle civilization with no margin for error. They were a people living on an environmental knife's edge. Into this vulnerable world came the trigger. The catastrophic century-long period of severe drought that began around 750 AD. The seasonal rains, which the Maya had depended upon for 1,000 years, became unreliable and then failed altogether. The great reservoirs dried up, and the maize crops, the foundation of their entire society, withered in the fields, leading to widespread, devastating famine. Faced with a crisis their ancestors had never imagined, the divine kings, the Ajah, responded in the only way they knew how. To gain resources and to appease the angry gods who they believed were withholding the rain, they went to war. But these were no longer the traditional ritualized conflicts of the past. This was desperate, total warfare, a brutal struggle between starving cities for control of the last remaining fertile lands and reliable water sources. This response, however, only accelerated the catastrophe in a deadly feedback loop. Constant brutal warfare pulled farmers away from their fields, making the famine even worse. It shattered the trade routes that brought in essential goods, and it turned the countryside into a place of terror, forcing populations to flee their homes and fields to huddle behind hastily built fortifications. The more desperate the situation became, the more they fought, and the more they fought, the more desperate the situation became. This brings us to the final, fatal stage of the collapse, the twilight of the gods. The entire political and religious authority of the Maya king rested on a single sacred promise, that through his rituals and his bloodletting, he could maintain the cosmic order and guarantee the rains and the harvest. As the droughts dragged on, year after agonizing year, and as the endless wars brought only more death and misery, this sacred promise was broken. The king's rituals had failed. The gods were not listening. The people, starving and terrorized, lost faith not just in their king, but in the entire system of divine kingship and the gods themselves. The social contract that had held their world together for centuries simply dissolved. Faced with famine, endless war, and a failed political and religious system, the common people made the only logical choice left to them. They voted with their feet. They abandoned the great stone cities and the holy lords who had failed them, melting back into the jungle to survive in smaller, scattered, and more sustainable communities. The Great Exodus, cities returned to the jungle. The end of the classic Maya world in the southern lands was not a single fiery apocalypse. It was a slow, quiet, and profoundly sad fading. The great cities were not, for the most part, conquered and burned by a foreign enemy. They simply emptied out. Over a period of about a century and a half, the people who had sustained these magnificent urban centers for generations made a collective, desperate choice. they left. This was the Great Exodus. We can imagine the impossible decision faced by a single family. For generations, their ancestors had lived in the shadow of the Great Pyramids of Tikal, farming their small plot of land and paying their tribute of maize to the divine king. But now the rains had failed again. The city's reservoirs were dry, and the maize stalks were withered and barren. The king's rituals and blood sacrifices had produced nothing but more empty promises. The endless wars with rival cities had brought only misery and fear. And so, they make a choice. One night, they gather their few remaining possessions, turn their backs on the stone temples that have defined their entire world, and melt away into the jungle, seeking a new life in a place where the corn might still grow, where they might find water, where they might be safe from the constant warfare that has consumed their homeland. This individual story, repeated hundreds of thousands of times over, is what the archaeological record shows. The evidence suggests that the great ceremonial centers and the palaces of the kings were the first to be abandoned. The monumental architecture, which had required enormous resources and labor to maintain, was simply too expensive to upkeep in a time of crisis. For a time in some cities, it appears that commoners moved into the empty plazas and grand residences, building crude cooking fires on the fine plaster floors, squatters in the crumbling houses of their gods and kings. But eventually, they too moved on, driven by the same relentless pressures of drought and famine. Population estimates based on archaeological surveys paint a stark picture. At Tikal, the population at its peak in the 8th century may have exceeded 60,000 people. By the end of the 10th century, it had plummeted to just a few thousand, and within another century, it was essentially abandoned. Across the southern lowlands, the population decline was catastrophic, with some estimates suggesting a drop of 90% or more in the hardest-hit areas. And as the last humans departed, the jungle, which had been held at bay for centuries, began its slow and patient work of reclamation. First, the wind would have carried seeds into the cracks of the great empty plazas. Small plants would take root, their tendrils breaking apart the plaster surfaces. Then the powerful roots of the great kapok and ramon trees would have begun their relentless work, undermining the foundations of the temples, splitting the stone staircases, and toppling the carved monuments of the kings. Over the centuries, a thick green blanket of vegetation grew over everything. The towering pyramids, once visible for miles across the canopy, became indistinguishable from the natural hills, their sharp stone lines softened and shrouded by earth and trees. The vast open plazas where thousands had once gathered for ceremonies became quiet, shaded clearings on the jungle floor. The roar of the crowd in the ball courts was replaced by the guttural, echoing call of the howler monkey. The sounds of human life, of chanting priests and chattering markets, gave way to the buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves. The cities had fallen silent. For nearly 1,000 years, the great centers of the classic Maya civilization would remain in this state, hidden from the outside world. Their history, their science, and their art lay dormant under the jungle canopy. The memory of what they were survived only in the oral traditions of the scattered descendant communities who had forged a new, simpler way of life in the forest. To the rest of the world, it was as if they had never existed at all, waiting silently for the explorers who would, in a distant future, stumble upon these green mountains and rediscover the lost world that slept beneath. Survival and transformation. The Maya. Endure. The story of the classic Maya collapse in the south, with its silent cities and abandoned plazas, is a dramatic tale of decline. But it is crucially not the end of the story of the Maya people. The collapse was not an extinction, it was a transformation. As the great urban centers of the southern rainforest emptied out, the center of gravity of the Maya world shifted, giving rise to a final brilliant flowering of their culture in the north. In the flatter, drier landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula, a new generation of cities not only survived but thrived, reaching their peak as their southern cousins were being reclaimed by the jungle. The greatest and most magnificent of these was Chichen Itza. Its art and architecture were distinctly Maya, yet they were infused with a new cosmopolitan spirit, showing strong influences from the cultures of central Mexico, particularly the Toltec, This was a city of warriors and merchants whose power was represented by the iconic feathered serpent god, Kukulkan. They built the largest ball court in the ancient Americas, a grand temple. Pyramid known as El Castillo, and a vast temple of the warriors, flanked by hundreds of carved stone columns. These northern cities prospered because they adapted. Instead of relying solely on the precarious rainfall needed for intensive maize farming, they built their power on a robust maritime trade network. Using massive seafaring dugout canoes, they controlled the flow of goods like salt, honey, cotton, and obsidian around the entire coast of the peninsula and into the wider Caribbean world. It was a more resilient and outward-looking economic system that allowed them to flourish for centuries after the southern collapse. Chichen Itza dominated the northern Maya lowlands from roughly 800 to 1000 AD, during the very period when the southern cities were dying. After Chichen Itza's decline, other northern centers like Mayapan rose to prominence, maintaining Maya civilization in the north until the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. But even after Chichen Itza and the other northern cities saw their own power wane, and even after the brutal Spanish conquest centuries later, the Maya people themselves endured. This is the most crucial part of their story. They survived by adapting, by retreating from the great cities into smaller, more sustainable farming communities, and by fiercely guarding the core of their culture, their languages, their traditions, and their deep connection to the land. The Spanish conquest, which began in earnest in the 1520s, was devastating. Diseases like smallpox, to which the Maya had no immunity, killed millions. The conquistadors destroyed countless Maya texts, viewing them as works of the devil. A Spanish friar named Diego de Landa, in a particularly tragic act, burned an unknown number of Maya codices, the folded bark paper books that contain their history and knowledge, in a bonfire in 1562. Only 4 Maya codices survived to the present day. Despite these catastrophes, the Maya survived. They resisted Spanish rule through a series of rebellions, with the last independent Maya kingdom, the Itza of Tayasal in Guatemala, not falling until 1697, nearly 200 years after first European contact. They preserved their languages in secret, passing them down through generations. They maintained their agricultural traditions, their weaving techniques, their stories. Today, more than 7 million Maya people live in their ancestral homelands of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They are not the relics of a lost civilization. They are a living, breathing people, the direct descendants of the men and women who built the Great Pyramids and carved the intricate glyphs we marvel at today. Many still speak one of the 30 surviving Mayan languages, which belong to a single linguistic family, but are as different from one another as the Romance languages of Europe. In the highlands of Guatemala, Maya women still weave textiles with intricate patterns that carry ancient symbolic meanings, designs, that can be traced back centuries. In the villages of the Yucatan, some communities still practice religious rituals that blend the Catholic faith brought by the Spanish with a deep reverence for their ancient gods of the forest and the cornfield. The Hanal Pixen, or Food of the Souls, is a Maya version of the Day of the Dead, celebrated throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. Families prepare traditional foods and build altars to welcome back the spirits of their ancestors, a practice that echoes the ancient Maya belief in the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. In the highlands of Guatemala, the ceremonies of the Ajay, the Maya daykeepers or spiritual guides, continue to this day, performing rituals based on the 260-day Tzolk'in calendar that their ancestors used more than 1,000 years ago. Therefore, the classic Maya collapse was not the death of a people, but the end of a specific political and social system based on divine kings and massive, resource-hungry cities. The silent cities are not the tombs of a vanished race. They are the abandoned capitals of a resilient people who survived by changing their way of life. The story of the Maya is not just an archaeological mystery of a world that was lost. It is a living history, a powerful testament to the ability of a culture to endure, to adapt, and to remember. Echoes. Across time. What the Maya teach us. We began our journey with a profound mystery, the image of magnificent stone cities, once teeming with life, lying silent and abandoned in the heart of the jungle. We have followed the story of the classic Maya, from their brilliant golden age to the complex and agonizing story of their decline. We have investigated the clues left behind in the earth and carved into the stones, a world of escalating warfare, a fragile environment pushed to its limits, and a sky that finally refused to give rain. We now have a compelling picture of how this great civilization unraveled. But the story of the silent cities continues to captivate us, not just because of the mystery of their fall, but because of the powerful lessons their echoes teach us across the centuries. The first and most sobering echo is a cautionary tale. The story of the classic Maya collapse is a powerful reminder of the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations. For centuries, their success was built on a brilliant but precarious system. Their population grew, and their kings reached for the heavens with ever grander pyramids, all supported by an agricultural system that was straining the limits of a difficult tropical environment in some regions. Their deep belief that their sacred rituals and divine kings could control the natural world was shattered by a force they could not command, a catastrophic long-term shift in the climate. Their story serves as a timeless warning about the delicate balance between a civilization's ambition and the environment that sustains it. It reminds us that no society, no matter how sophisticated its technology or how deeply held its beliefs, is immune to the forces of nature. In our own time, as we face our own climate challenges and environmental pressures, the Maya collapse offers uncomfortable parallels. Like the classic Maya, we live in a time of growing populations, stressed resources, and increasingly unpredictable climate patterns. The Maya could not have known that their architectural ambitions would contribute to deforestation severe enough to make their civilization more vulnerable to drought. We, however, have the advantage of hindsight and scientific understanding. The question is whether we will heed the warning written in the stones of Tikal and Copan. But there is another echo, one of incredible human resilience. The collapse of the great southern cities was not the end of the Maya people. It was the end of a particular way of life. The exodus from the urban centers was a traumatic but ultimately successful survival strategy. By abandoning the unsustainable model of the divine kings and their resource-hungry cities, the Maya people were able to adapt and endure. They survived the fall of their own golden age. They survived the turmoil of the centuries that followed. They survived the brutal conquest by the Spanish. Their culture did not break. It bent, adapted, and continued. This is perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, that a people are more than their monuments, more than their kings, more than their grandest achievements. The true measure of a civilization is not in the height of its pyramids, but in the resilience of its people and the endurance of its culture. The Maya understood something profound about time. To them, history was not a straight line, but a series of great cycles, eras of creation and destruction that repeated endlessly. The calendar they created, with its complex interlocking wheels of days and years, reflected this belief in the eternal return, the idea that what has been will be again. Their own collapse, in this view, was not an aberration but part of the natural rhythm of the universe, one cycle ending so that another could begin. And so, we are left with a story of two legacies. There is the legacy of the silent cities themselves, with their magnificent pyramids and their intricate glyphs, a testament to the heights a civilization can reach, and the speed with which it can fall when the foundations crack. And there is the living legacy of the Maya people, who still walk the same lands as their ancestors, who still speak the languages of the ancient scribes, and who are a powerful reminder that a culture is always more than its grandest monuments. The silent cities of the jungle are more than just a historical mystery. They are a mirror held up to our own world. They force us to consider the sustainability of our own civilization, our relationship with our climate and our environment, and the complex, often unforeseen consequences of our own choices. The Maya believed that the universe moved in great repeating cycles of creation and destruction. Their story is perhaps the most powerful example history has to offer, that no civilization, no matter how brilliant or powerful, is guaranteed to last forever. But it also teaches us that a people who remain adaptable, who maintain their connection to the land and who preserve the core of their culture, can endure through even the most catastrophic of changes. The pyramids may fall silent, but the people themselves continue. Their voices, once thought lost forever, now speak to us again through the deciphered glyphs, telling us their stories of triumph and tragedy, of glory and collapse, of endings and new beginnings. As you lie in the darkness tonight, perhaps you can hear those voices, echoing across the centuries from the heart of the jungle, the whispers of the Maya speaking to us still from their silent cities, offering us both warning and hope, reminding us of our own fragility and our own capacity to endure. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of the Maya and their magnificent civilization has brought the beauty and mystery of the ancient world to life for you. If you enjoyed this exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Whispers of Time for more journeys through history's greatest mysteries. I wish you a calm and peaceful night, wherever you are in the world.